Hi, I'm Ross. This is the fourth video in my installment of documenting my boat project, redoing the instrument panel, adding some engine instruments. As I said in the last few videos, I'm not a mechanic. Anything you hear, anything I say on here is just my opinion, sharing my experience with you. Um, if you want to see the whole series of videos, I think just go to YouTube and type in Slipperlilly. That's a keyword I use that should hopefully bring up all the whole series of videos. So let's get into it.
Here's the before picture. When I had everything torn out and then got everything done and installed, is what it looked like. I did, like I said, I did two sets of panels, one in Kevlar, one in carbon fiber, and that's just because I wanted to be able to mix and match. Halfway through, I figured out what I was going to want to use, so I didn't actually finish out every single panel. That would have been kind of a waste, but I wanted to be able to mix and match and see what kind of different variations looked like. So for starters, you may want to build something like I built to hold the panels. Since I was going to doing multiple panels, built this little holder thing. It's a concrete foundation, as you can get at Home Depot. There for posts or pillars. Then a scrap of 1x. Then I cut out some 1-inch wood dowels, and you can just screw those to your 1x the base there. And for attaching the panels to the dowels, just use a couple spots of glue. When you're done, you can break it right off. And this was invaluable because instrument panel, you're probably going to need to work the edges too and wrap your carbon fiber around the edges and back underneath. So you're going to need to get to the edge and then also underneath where the carbon fiber is. So you might want to make something like this. I found it to be invaluable. This shot I threw in just because I wanted to touch on the different, how the shade of your wood. This is the puke green looking panels. That was the Yucca board, and then I just covered it with a coat of epoxy with yellow color added to it. And then the bright yellow panel, I did the same thing, but that was the brighter wood. So you can see the difference it'll make. And it's, if you're not that anal about the shading and how it's going to affect your carbon fiber, your Kevlar, it's not that big a deal. But if there's a color you're trying to match, it could have an impact. So you got your panels all done. So I'm just going to show you the way I did it as far as getting started with the layup. I took my panel, laid it on the Kevlar face up, as you can see there, and then I took masking tape and you went around the panel. But that space between the panel and the tape, you want to keep that about at least an inch, preferably maybe an inch and a half, because remember you got to go cover around, wrap it, cover the edges, and then you want it to fold back on itself a good inch, maybe even an inch and a half, because you're going to need enough space to um, add more epoxy on the backside to hold the Kevlar down. So from there, I just took a Sharpie and went around the tape about from the inside edge of the tape outward about a 1/4 inch, and then I use the Sharpie to make a line there. What you want is that 1/4 inch. You're going to cut that line, and that little 1/4 inch of masking tape that's left. What that's going to do is that's going to hold the fibers, the ends and your edges of Kevlar together or carbon fiber, and that'll keep all the little strands together, hold all the strands together, so it doesn't start unwinding on you. From there, obviously, just go around and cut it out. Yeah, you're gonna want to get some good industrial shears. What I use, I got some Milwaukee shears from Home Depot, um, and they work pretty well. I didn't need to get any special kind of carbon fiber or Kevlar cutting scissors. Although if you got access to them or you can find some, it's probably a good way to go. So from here, you're gonna want to take your pieces as you see them there. Take your piece of Kevlar, turn it over with the tape side face down, and then your panel face down on top of that, and then you'll start wrapping it. I did, as you see here, do one side and then tape it off, and then tape off the other side, and that's to keep it from sliding up and down as you're going around working the Kevlar. You can also use spray adhesive, from what I understand. I didn't think of it or try it or use it. I wasn't sure if that would contaminate the epoxy and all that, but there's plenty of YouTube videos on doing this, and some of them I've seen they use the spray adhesive to help, which would help a lot. So from there, I just finished taping off. Did the top, the bottom, then one side, then tape off the other side, and that'll more or less kind of secure it in place. And then from there, the challenging part is you're going to have the corners to work, and that's what I had spent a little bit of time doing, working the corners. And that was something I kind of grappled with throughout this whole project, working these corners, even when I was doing the epoxy, because you want to get them as flat and smooth as you can, no bumps or any folds sticking up. You'll see a little later some of the problems I had with separation and the strands coming apart as I was adding more epoxy to the corners, trying to keep them laying down. But again, in the end, it all came out fine. From what you see of the end result, you don't see any of that. I was able to cover it up and work everything fine. One of the things I added, used a little glue to help hold the corners down. That helped a little bit too. Um, and again, there are tons of YouTube videos out there on how to do carbon fiber. Watch them. In particular, I would recommend Googling building a carbon fiber tabletop because the technique is a little different when you're doing structural fiberglass or carbon fiber. You do not want an excess of epoxy. In something like this, a tabletop or an instrument panel, you're going to want an excess layer of epoxy because that's going to make your nice shiny surface. So here's a quick clip of me wrapping the instrument panel with the carbon fiber. And I started doing this with the wrapping and the tape because the first panel I didn't do that, and the fiber didn't want to lay down. It didn't want to wrap underneath and stay. It kept wanting to fold back out, resume its natural shape. So I thought, well, let me try this, and this will work. And it worked pretty well. But like I said, you can also use the spray adhesive. That would probably work pretty well too. I found the carbon fiber easier to work with than the Kevlar. The Kevlar is a little thicker and stiffer. Um, so now, obviously, when you're applying the epoxy, you want to remember to apply it underneath too, to the Kevlar underneath section. And yeah, with the tape there and slathering on epoxy, the backsides of my panels got kind of funky, but yeah, it's the backside. Who cares? I cleaned them up as best I could. It wasn't any big deal. So, given there's plenty of YouTube videos out there on how to do carbon fiber, I didn't get too much into details. Like I said, you'll want to reference the ones that show you how to do a tabletop out of carbon fiber. You see me using the notch trowel there, for example. That's something that's unique when you're doing a tabletop or an instrument panel like this. You spread the epoxy with your notch trowel so it leaves an excess amount of epoxy on the surface. One of the other things then you go back and do once you're done laying the epoxy down, you want to monitor it, and you'll take a blowtorch, use that to get out the air bubbles. That works pretty well too, but it takes a while. You got to monitor it because it takes a while for the air bubbles that are within the epoxy to float to the surface. So you can get at them with a blowtorch, and then they just pop and disappear. But it is something you'll want to monitor for like 30 minutes after you're done laying the epoxy because it does take time for all the air bubbles to make their way to the surface. Blotting it with a paintbrush is also something you saw me doing. That's just to break up the surface tension and allow the epoxy to flow out a little more. And then you'll see it dripping over the sides. That's fine. That's actually what you want. And what you do, just take that excess that's dripping over the sides and brush that into the underneath portion of your Kevlar or carbon fiber. Then I would typically stop working the epoxy once it started to get a little stiff. So here's a couple of shots of a panel I had trouble with the corners I mentioned before. These I didn't pre-wrap. I just laid the Kevlar on top and started applying the epoxy and then tried to work it underneath. And the corner areas just started fraying and come apart. It seemed like with every subsequent brush stroke, it just separated even more. So this clip I threw in because I wanted to show this is where I applied epoxy with black colorant in it. Problem is I ran out of black epoxy colorant and I couldn't find it anymore. I didn't want to wait 3 days to order it online. But you can see how it takes a fair amount. You can see it's not really turning this piece very black. It worked much better on the Yucca board. If you're going to use a color, obviously make sure it's one that's compatible with your epoxy. So from here, I'm just going to be going over things randomly, throwing up some clips so you can see how things turned out for me and some of the issues I had to deal with and how I dealt with them. I didn't go. You notice I didn't go over applying the first coat of epoxy. Again, there's plenty of YouTube videos you can reference for that. One of the things I mentioned earlier were starter kits. The website I used, Composite Envisions, had a pretty good selection of starter kits if you want to go that way. Make sure read the fine print. They don't all, most do, but not all come with actual carbon fiber. You select that separately, and remember, you're just going to get enough to do your job. If you want to do more, then you might want to buy in bulk a little bit. So here's a shot of the panel. This is the actual instrument panel I ended up using. This is after the first coat of epoxy, so it looks pretty gross. Um, but no matter, as I sanded it down, gave it the next coat. And with regard, this is a good point to stop and discuss two things: mechanical bonds versus chemical bonds. And you might hear those terms. And all that refers to is basically a chemical bond is when you put this follow on coat of epoxy on top of your last coat, where your last coat is still sticky. It hasn't set up and completely dried yet. And since it's still a little tacky, it's going to form a chemical bond with your new coat of epoxy. If you let that epoxy dry completely, then you're going to have to sand it. And that's basically you sand it to get it roughed up and add your follow-on coat of epoxy, and that's what's referred to as a mechanical bond. That's all. And in this type of work, it don't get hung up on, oh, I want to do it. I want to make sure it's a chemical bond. It doesn't matter. It's going to stick just as well. In my case, I think in every first application I did with the epoxy, I let it dry completely and then gave it a light sanding. Just I wanted to get rid of any imperfections. I didn't want them to show through. But you do need to be really careful because you don't want to actually sandpaper, direct contact, sand through your epoxy and have it directly contact your carbon fiber. Especially this carbon fiber, like I mentioned, it uses as an accent, it has the painted copper wire thread. And if you just get even close with sandpaper to that copper wire, you've ruined it. You're going to sand off the paint. And here you can see where I'm talking about. If you note down there at the bottom of the screen, you can see where it's obvious the copper wire that was sanded on, and the green paint was basically I inadvertently sanded it all off. And it's a good shot. You can see some of the other imperfections. Some you'll be able to sand out, but again, be careful sanding, trying to get them out, and then end up sanding through your epoxy and damaging your carbon fiber. Your subsequent layers of epoxy will probably cover most of this up, but and then obviously I want to stress in between applications of epoxy, you want to clean your material, your product real well. That's but you wipe it down real good with. I used acetone. And the other thing you want to be sure to do as best you can is get rid of these little white specks. Basically, those are just little pinholes that were in the epoxy, and then when you sanded it, it filled up with epoxy dust, and that has the potential to shine through your subsequent layers of epoxy. They're pretty easy to get rid of. I did it just by taking some compressed air, spraying compressed air directly right at them, and they cleared out. So here's another shot of some imperfections you're very likely to end up with. It's not a big deal. It's completely normal. This can be the result of some contaminant on the surface, maybe some foreign object, some particle that weren't able to clean off. And one thing you may be tempted to sand them away, but be very careful that when you're sanding, you don't sand through the epoxy and sand all the way down to your carbon fiber. In most cases, clean this off real good, another coat of epoxy, and it'll cover these up and you won't even notice them. So here's a shot of the Kevlar instrument panel I did after just the first initial coat of epoxy. And even this one, it was completely dry, so I had to give it a light sanding. And for sanding, I used in the 200 to 300 grit range. Just being real careful not to sand all the way through. In one case, I did sand all the way through on another panel, which would be the one here. You can see the scuff marks on the edge. I thought I had ruined it, but this was fine. This is the panel I ended up using. I just, after another, I think one or two more flood coats, and it was fine. It didn't even show up that much. In fact, you can be the judge. Here's the same piece finished. Um, so as you can see, yeah, with a couple more flood coats, you can't even tell where it's scuffed. You can see a couple dimples in the black carbon fiber, the spacer piece. I knew that was going to be covered up with a remote console, so I just left them. I wasn't worried about it. If this was something I wanted to be as perfect as possible, I would have given it another sanding and then another coat of epoxy. Because obviously, with each subsequent coat of epoxy, you have a little more to sand, so you can sand it down to where you get it to where you like it, and then you proceed with the buffing. One thing you're going to have to decide how you want to do is the labeling of your toggle switches. Uh, some people have them laser etched. I've read, or I've read online. Some people took them to a trophy shop and they can do the laser etching and whatnot. I didn't really want to go through the trouble. All I did was just use a Brother P Touch, um, and it ended up being a really kind of a cool, very inconspicuous look. And I just used the Brother P Touch, put it on, stuck it on, and then gave it another coat of epoxy. And it actually, more by accident, I think, came out. Actually, it looks pretty good. And the real thing in real life, when you see it, it's very conspicuous, but you can see them just well enough to be able to identify the switches. So the last thing I'm going to touch on, unless I suddenly remember something else, is wet sanding it and buffing it. Um, if you're new to this, that can be kind of a tough thing to do because you're taking your finished product, which is as shiny and glossy as it's ever going to be, and then taking sandpaper to it. But it's really the only way to get a nice, perfectly flat finish. And for me, my opinion, I like it better. It's worth the sacrifice to get it nice and flat and give it a factory look, if you will. Because it's going to have low spots in it. You can see here are the shiny areas where the sandpaper didn't hit. And that's using a mechanical, a square electric sander. So you can see the surface isn't flat, even though it may kind of appear to be. Um, it's not that much work, and for me personally, I like the finished product. The sandpapers I use, they basically start off with about a 6 or 800, and go up to a 1200, and then a 2000, and then a 3000, and then you bring out the buffing compound, and then the polishing compound, and then it ends up looking like this. This is my finish, obviously the finished product. Um, so that's an option. It's not something you have to do. You can always try it, and if you don't like it and you want to put on another coat of epoxy, what the heck, you can do that too if you want. So I think that about does it for this video. Um, so if you want to do something like this, just do like I did. I've never done anything like I have no experience with fiberglass, no experience working with epoxy, never done it before. Just watched a whole bunch of YouTube videos and then jumped in and do it. Once you start doing it, you're going to learn really quickly. It's an artisan, it's a craftsmanship thing, but it'll come really fast. So um, anyways, thanks for watching. If you want to see my videos, just go to YouTube and I think type in Slipperlilly and hopefully they'll all come up. Thanks.